trying to channel Pat Foye. Pat Foye is the president of the MTA. He and I have been working on infrastructure projects now for about a decade and trying to streamline infrastructure. He sent me notes and asked me to deliver them as best I can. Building infrastructure requires two things to do it sensibly. It requires a reasonable process, including environmental review and public input, because you don't want people to arbitrarily go in and put highways through parks or the like. And I'm a big believer in that as a former chair of Manhattan, zoning of Manhattan Community Board 6 when I was a young lawyer. I believe deeply in public input. So you want to have a reasonable, fair process, and you also want to be able to manage the contracts sufficiently when you're building the infrastructure, so you don't waste taxpayer money. You get it done quickly, and you get it done. What's happened, and the problem with bureaucracy, and I think there was an implication that somehow we're trying to restrict bureaucrats, is that the people in charge, and Nicole just alluded to this, don't have the authority to make those choices. There is no one in the federal government who has the authority to say, in one situation that Pat was involved in and I wrote about, oh, you're just raising the roadway of the bridge using the same foundations. There's no environmental impact, or virtually none. Give me 50 pages of construction impacts. Instead, in that particular case, there was a 20,000-page environmental analysis that took 5 years to write, because no one had the authority to say to the naysayers, no, that's not important. We need to get this bridge done, and the environmental impacts are obviously minimal because you're just using the same components of the bridge. So one of the problems with modern bureaucracy is that there aren't clear lines of authority that ultimately end up in a democratically elected leader. So democracy doesn't work. The bureaucracy doesn't work, and democracy doesn't work to hold them accountable. So Pat's points here were that first, government's failing at many fundamental functions, like rebuilding infrastructure well, because no one in the bureaucracy has the authority to make the needed choices. So it's a question, in this case, as in Nicole's case, of bureaucratic empowerment. His second point is that these failures are not just failures that affect some limited group. It actually affects the entire functioning of the society. In the case of infrastructure, it affects our competitiveness. It also affects job creation. His third point is that it disproportionately harms the poor. Is that many of the projects required, for example, to fix up public housing, which Nicole's going to continue to talk about in a second, or the MTA, are subsidized programs where we need to both marshal the resources to help people get to work at a reasonable price and such. And if you make it too expensive, then you don't end up doing as many projects that would otherwise help them. And his last point is that there's no penalty and no accountability for the extraordinary waste that occurs as a result of these legacy bureaucracies. And by legacy bureaucracies, so it's like sediment in the harbor. They kind of build up over decades, and Paul Light was referencing it. You need to be able to make choices when you're building something. There are trade-offs all the time. And what's happened is that these labor rules and bureaucratic rules have piled up so that, for example, with the Second Avenue subway, the cost for tunneling per mile was $2.5 billion. It's in Paris, using the same machine. France is a country not known for its efficient labor laws. It cost $500 million per mile. Now, there were some special things about the Second Avenue subway. It was deeper and such, but they had 4 or 5 times as many people because of labor rules and bureaucratic constraints manning these machines. Well, that money is coming out of the pockets of taxpayers. It could be used for other purposes. And so we're talking about, Pat's central point is that it's an incredibly important function of government, and I agree with Sally's list of important functions of government. I'm for government enhances our freedom. Incredibly important function of government to rebuild our infrastructure and do so in a sensible way. But that requires giving the people who have the responsibility to do that the authority to make the choices. To have procurement is a great example. The procurement codes are completely broken. You have to, you need oversight, but giving people, I'll call it responsibility, not discretion, is not only not an invitation to corruption. Every study of corruption has concluded that the best way to prevent it is to give identifiable people responsibility to make decisions. It has been to not have dense bureaucracies, not have too many checks and balances so you can't identify who's making decisions, is to be able to put the spotlight on somebody and then you can check their bank account. And so it's really important to give people the responsibility needed to do their job. Pat's been there. He was the executive director of the Port Authority when we first started working together. Now he's president of MTA. And I wish he were here to deliver this himself, but he would be happy to talk to any of you who want to talk further. It's an incredibly important point in getting this infrastructure initiative going for our country.